Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about Out West from 1918. And this continues my series where I try to review the entire filmography of Buster Keaton. This is the first film that at least we can see after the Comique Film Company, or Fatty Arbuckle, Al St. John, and Buster Keaton all moved to California to continue making their films. That originally all the previous films that I have reviewed were actually all filmed in New York. This kind of represents a change. It represents Buster Keaton working on films in California, which he would obviously be very successful at. And I think when you think of Buster Keaton and this kind of silent comedy, you think of the space that California allows. Now, I'm in Brooklyn, New York, so you'd think I'd probably take more of the New York side, but I've always sort of preferred these films when they moved to California, particularly in this Arbuckle run. I think because of the space, it has more fun, particularly this short, Out West, which is dark and seedy and has some shots that could, cinematography wise, look like they could be out of a silent drama as much as it is a silent comedy. It has some actually genuinely unpleasant bits, but also has a lot of kind of freewheeling fun to the whole thing while also being really dark. It's kind of an odd mixture, and it's sprawling locations and all the various kind of bigger ideas they have in this. I almost want to believe because they moved to California suddenly their budgets were upped. I don't really have any background information on that, but it almost sort of feels that way. Fatty Arbuckle plays a drifter who is hitching a ride in the train's water tank, which actually looks pretty horrific. Like those are the shots I was talking about where it really looks like kind of from a darker kind of silent film. And then he is discovered stealing food from some of the passengers and is kicked off the train and has to find the nearest settlement, and kind of runs into Al St. John's character of Wild Bill Hiccup doing an attempted robbery at the bar and killing the bartender. Fatty Arbuckle goes in and takes him out just by accident, and so now he becomes the bartender. So not only does he have a place to live, but suddenly he has a job too. He has to go through various crazy gags throughout this film and stop Al St. John from taking the girl played by Alice Lake that he loves so much. For the most part, I think this is a really kind of interesting Keaton film. It's always one I particularly like, but there's always been one scene that I think most people object to. It can almost overpower the conversation of the entire short. There was a scene where there's a black guy and he's suddenly shot at his feet and he has to dance while people are shooting at his feet, and there's been the debate online that was not them necessarily being racist or as mean-spirited, because this is technically supposed to be a satire of westerns at the time, particularly like William S. Hart movies and things like that, supposedly at least. The arguments were made that maybe that was in a lot of these westerns, that most of them, just by the numbers, are probably lost, had these sequences in them and they're trying to kind of parody them, and it is sort of played off in the end as melodrama, but it's still a little disturbing. You know, for films that are almost 100 years old, they actually age like remarkably well, like way better than you'd ever think they would. So every time they have a sequence that maybe doesn't age as well, it's often a little shocking, because you're like, oh right, it was 100 years ago and like everything sucked. I forgot about that whole thing. This kindly reminds you that everyone did suck back then, and that would happen, and it's sad to see Buster Keaton and Fatty Arbuckle joining in at the shooting, kind of laughing as well. I wish that wasn't in there, but it is. The way these films are kind of structured and laid out, it's just kind of one little sequence. It doesn't have too much to do with the plot. It's not like the whole movie they're going around shooting black people's feet or something. It's just that one sequence. It is troubling, and there are various things about the Native Americans in this film that people have also found offensive. I think overall what this film's doing with its kind of darker thing and its use of space is quite remarkable, and makes it probably one of the bigger finds of Arbuckle and Keaton's career, particularly when you have the scenes of Buster Keaton shooting around this rock at his enemy. I thought was really cool. I love all the stuff on the train, which I guess you could read into and say, oh, Buster Keaton maybe directed that or helped direct that or came up with the idea. I don't think that's really probably true, but it was cool seeing Fatty Arbuckle light a match on a moving train. I don't know if that's from something, but that was pretty neat. Buster Keaton also has a pretty crazy sequence where he takes a shot glass and puts each one on his eye, and like I always thought, is that dangerous? Like, but Buster Keaton did it, but I'm not as good as Buster Keaton. But when I saw that really surprised. I was really so into that. It was like, whoa, somebody put like shots in their eyes? I wonder how that works. I mean, it was just say like the alcohol cures anything and stuff is like a joke, but it's still like a pretty memorable joke. I don't think I've ever laughed at that, but I've just wondered at the logistics of that whole thing more than anything. This film has a story by credit by Natalie Talmadge, who would eventually become Buster Keaton's wife. And it's interesting, she had apparently a smaller part in A Country Hero, and now in this. I feel like we're probably going to be talking about her a little more in the future of Buster Keaton, but it's interesting she has a story by credit. A lot of people say it was just given to her as kind of like a vanity title or something like that, and she didn't really do anything. I would prefer to think that she maybe might have said something and they went, yeah, okay, but we should probably credit her. That's what I think. Story by credit just means you have the basic story of it. It doesn't really mean she had that much to do with it, so it's not really worth getting that upset about. I think it's mainly Arbuckle's movie, but she still has a story by credit. How she got it or how much her involvement is, I guess, you know, we can debate for all times, but I sort of don't think that she suddenly got in just because of connections and things like that. I think that's a little silly. Despite Out West having some troubling elements to it, I think it generally is a really fun Western comedy. I used to actually play like Baltimore gutter music while I watched it and give it this kind of like frenetic feeling, which I don't think watching it without it does, but I used to be so into that. It definitely shows off the broad humor of Fatty Arbuckle, particularly the scene where the horse gets drunk and kind of like moseys up. I mean, that's a little silly and stupid, but Al St. John's actually pretty good as a villain. I noticed like Buster Keaton and Fatty Arbuckle have amazing chemistry throughout this film, probably better chemistry than I've ever seen them have. And Keaton's actually really good as the sheriff. I thought he did a pretty good job. He doesn't really smile or anything, kind of is almost as closest to stone face as we've seen throughout this series, or at least so far. I quite like what they do with him as a character. This is probably the first short I've seen where Buster Keaton looked really, really cool. He didn't like look lame before. I really wanted to follow that character, and it's interesting having these two plot lines like exist separate, by the way, and then kind of converge when Arbuckle bumbles through and everything like that. You don't really see that through a lot of Arbuckle stuff. It's usually like everyone's connected at the beginning and you kind of go from there. This, it like took a minute to get there, and I like Arbuckle's character, you know, being kicked off the train and all that stuff. This kind of has a fun vibe to it. I don't know how much it's satirizing, and because so much of what they are actually parodying has probably been lost and I'll never get to see. I could never really say this. I honestly think it's just like they use more of the Western setting to do gags off of that and less any satirical angle. I didn't really notice a satirical angle. I am not an expert in silent Western, so if someone is, maybe they will see Out West and go, oh, it references that more than William S. Hart. There's so much stuff in here, and I'm like, okay, cool. As for watching it without that knowledge, I still think it's fun and very beautiful and very interesting. It might be troubling in those few little parts, but I think Out West has enough beauty and strange cinematography, particularly for a comedy. It doesn't like enhance laughter, it kind of like makes you feel bad for these people, but I kind of like the high budget of it. Did that really help this film necessarily? No, but it makes it certainly prettier to look at and makes you think of the possibilities, and almost feels like the right setting for Buster Keaton, particularly if you're kind of like aware of him and aware of how most of his films were shot, and especially the things with trains in the Old West and all that. I like Out West. I think I would just be cautious watching it if something like that offends you, but it is not as integral to the plot, frankly. Fatty Arbuckle ended up making one of the more fun and kind of moodily shot Western comedies that I've ever seen, and probably one of the best Western comedies I've ever seen, other than like Blazing Saddles and stuff like that. Take that, A Million Ways to Die in the West, because he understood you just kind of have to do gags off of it and not get too obsessed with the genre necessarily, or at least that's how I'm seeing it now, since I can't see what it's really satirizing. Maybe it's not satirizing as many things as we think it is, because it doesn't necessarily feel like a satire, but it's still a really fun silent Western comedy in the best sense of the way. So if you've seen Out West and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to.